Brand new houses standing where my cattle used to graze wasn't a misunderstanding or a dream. It was a theft, a slow, deliberate robbery wearing perfume and a smile. My name's Ezekiel Thornfield, but most folks just call me Zeke. 67 years old, 40 of them spent as a land surveyor across 3 Tennessee counties. I've measured every fence, creek, and forgotten boundary this side of. The mist still clung to the holler like an old quilt. Honeysuckle and diesel in the air, that's the smell of progress, they say, but to me it always smelled like something dying slow. I'd just come back from Oregon after helping my daughter through a rough divorce, thinking about coffee, quiet, and maybe patching the fence if ambition struck. But when I turned onto my gravel drive, something felt wrong, too still, too clean. Then came the sound. Children laughing, lawnmowers humming, the suburban anthem of intrusion. I walked down the ridge, coffee still steaming. The same 847 acres my grandfather cleared with his own hands in 1924. The same place where my wife Martha carved our initials into that old oak tree the summer we met. All of it paved, landscaped, and colonized without so much as a knock on my door. That's when she appeared, the queen bee herself. Victoria, Vicky Ashworth, rolling toward me in a golf cart with the confidence of a Roman. Like she was talking to a trespasser, not the man whose dirt was under her tires. This is private property. Heritage Meadows is for residents and invited guests only. For a second level, this here's my property. Been in my family near a century. Her laugh scratched the air like fingernails on a chalkboard. Oh, honey, she said, flipping through a folder thick enough to. She clutched that folder to her chest like it was a nuclear launch code. Not required to share private HOA documents, she said, smiling. But I'm sure we can work out an arrangement. These families have children, you know. That was the moment the fog in my chest turned to fire. This wasn't a mistake. It was theft, dressed up in suburban manners. 3 days later, her husband's cousin, Deputy Mike Ashworth, showed up at my door with a restraining order. Said I'd threatened residents with surveying equipment. My tape measure, apparently, now qualified as a weapon. The order barred me from stepping foot on my own back 40 acres. Violated, and I'd be in jail. Then came the smear campaign. Flyers, Facebook posts, whispers in diners. Crazy old man won't let progress happen. Photos of my weathered farmhouse beside their shiny subdivision. My mailbox became the front line of a digital war. And at the center of it all, Vicky, the self-proclaimed savior of Heritage Meadows, spinning lies about safety, children, and property values, while I sat on my porch holding the deeds my grandfather signed with his own. The first crack appeared in the paperwork. A $50 filing fee for a multi-million-dollar property transfer, absurd on its face. Then the notary stamp. Eleanor Hutchkins. Sweet woman. I called my oldest friend, Clarence Bulldog McKenzie, a man who could quote property law the way preachers quote scripture. He brought his GPS equipment, spit tobacco juice every few feet, and walked the perimeter with me like we were tracking ghosts. 2 days later, he spat on the dirt and said, Zeke, every inch of this subdivision's sitting on your land like fleas on a hound dog. I should have felt relief, but what I felt was rage. Because even with proof, power was on their side. Within a week, Vicky had hired Sentinel Security, patrolling the perimeter in golf carts like my cattle were plotting an insurrection. The county sent letters threatening to condemn my farmhouse as a public nuisance. Social media flamed hotter than a July bonfire. That night, I sat in Martha's old garden, the smell of her roses in the air, staring at the stars she used to love. I thought about giving in, selling out, moving somewhere warm, forgetting it all. Bank transfers, council votes. I followed the ink. And what I found would turn Heritage Meadows into ground zero for one of the biggest scandals the state had ever seen. The smear machine didn't tire, it just changed uniforms. The HOA queen recruited volunteers like she was raising a neighborhood militia, community safety committee. They called it clipboards and reflective vests and a sense of purpose that comes easy when you've picked the wrong enemy. They paced my fence line at sundown, took photos of me feeding my own cattle as if alfalfa were contraband, and posted those pictures on the Sweetwater Springs Facebook page with captions about unhinged behavior and public risk. They forgot I've lived inside courthouses for 40 years, not as a lawyer, but as the man who drags out the map no one can argue with. I went back to the records, filing fees that made no sense. A miracle notary, Eleanor Hutchkins, signing months after she'd been laid to rest. God bless her cobbler and her honesty. A paper trail stitched with thread so bright even a half-blind barn cat could follow it. And then the night, I found wires running from my oak trees back toward Heritage Meadows Estates. New plastic, raw cuts, the sour sting of fresh insulation. Cameras hidden in my canopy, pulling juice off my own meter to watch me on my own land. Years ago, I'd helped a client track copper thieves with a cheap electromagnetic field detector. I pulled the same trick here, and the readings lit up like county fair fireworks. I logged it, photographed it, and labeled each image like evidence in a museum of arrogance. The next morning, my insurance evaporated. Policy canceled for significant change in land usage, with aerial photos of the subdivision used as proof. I knew that smell. In '03, I'd helped a neighbor catch a claims adjuster gaming the system. The timing is always the tell. Turns out Vicky worked part-time at Mutual Trust Insurance. And within hours of the cancellation, she'd sprinkled smugness across social media like confetti at a parade. They hustled me into Judge Harold Peton's courtroom. Peton, who golfs with Brad Ashworth every Thursday, who owns stock in 3 development firms and once called eminent domain an efficiency tool. My court-appointed attorney mispronounced my name twice and smelled like a hangover. He told me to accept reality and negotiate. I told him I wanted a jury, a map, and a microphone. They postponed indefinitely, which is small town for die slow, while they were grinding me down. Heritage Meadows held bake sales and car washes to fund their defense of property values. 50 grand raised in a weekend, the kind of easy money that buys Tuscan sunsets. Brad's vacation photos showed up online. Kiani, stone villas, a grin that said other people's cash tastes like good wine. The comments cheered community spirit. I took screenshots. Every like, every emoji, paper, all of it. The intimidation campaign turned feral. Dead possums on my porch, a raccoon when they wanted to make a point. Nails scattered on my drive, 2 sets of truck tires ruined before noon. Anonymous calls at 3 a.m., that hour when even strong men feel their heartbeats, hissing how accidents happen to stubborn old men. Sentinel guards told me I couldn't touch my own mailbox because it sat on their easement. I pictured my grandfather, boots muddy, laughing a laugh that wasn't joy. That's when an angel in denim walked up my steps with a notebook and a look that said she'd already smelled this kind of rot in bigger cities. Ruby Morgan, investigative reporter for the Nashville Tribune, a woman with the kind of steady eyes you either trust or run from. She'd watched Channel 7's sob story and heard the hollow ring under the violins. "Mr. Thornfield," she said, "I've covered men in suits who stole whole towns. Your paperwork, can I see all of it?" I gave her boxes. She gave me momentum. 3 days later, she'd confirmed my title, pulled marketing archives showing Heritage Meadows was advertised 2 years before the supposed purchase, and dug up Brad's sealed juvenile record. Real estate fraud in Kentucky, a dirty coin minted early. She traced cached web pages with the Wayback Machine, the internet's attic where deleted lies still collect dust. Premeditation, spelled in pixels. County power shifted from smiling to snarling. They floated eminent domain, called the subdivision essential housing, appraised my 847 acres at $80. 000. Dirt cheap if you ignore the $12 million they whispered in developer deals. My well turned within a week. Metallic taste, cattle sick, storm drains from Heritage Meadows bleeding construction. Toxins into Willow Creek. The water test glowed red where it should have been clear. Stress finally exacted its toll. Chest pains, antiseptic stings, the beep-beep of machines in a hospital room that wasn't mine, air too clean to be real. That's where Vicky leaned over me with a smile that never reached her eyes, and a $200,000 settlement folded like a silk handkerchief. "Zeke," she cooed, "you don't want to die over dirt. Think of your family." I thought of Martha's journal, one line written in a hand that always calmed me. Zeke doesn't fight because it's easy. He fights because it's right. That was the last day I considered surrender. While I was hooked to tubes, Brad tried a bureaucrat's masterstroke, an emergency city council resolution to annex Heritage Meadows into Sweetwater Springs. yanking jurisdiction out of the county mud and into city water where his influence ran deep. They hid the notice in legal classifieds and set the vote for 10 days out. It would have worked on most folks. Ruby's investigation shifted into overdrive. Her computer forensics team uncovered a forgery ring, dead notaries resurrected across 4 counties, copy-paste, stamps, digital signatures ripped from legitimate closings like teenagers pirating movies. Meanwhile, Vicky levied special assessments on residents, thousands per household, to protect your homes, and threatened foreclosure for anyone who hesitated. People paid because fear is fast. Just when despair should have settled in, cracks formed inside the subdivision. Late-night phone calls. From new parents, from teachers, from nurses who said, in whispers, that something felt wrong. They'd watched BMW payments get tagged as legal defense, and the math no longer added. I used Ruby's budget to hire an independent building inspector, a man too stubborn to frighten and too proud to lie. He found 47 code violations, houses on wooden platforms where pilings should be, electrical systems wired like a dare, buried swampland masquerading as bedrock. One spark in Heritage Meadows could turn into a suburban bonfire. Vicky tried bribery next. $20. 000 slid toward Drive Raymond Stevens if he'd sign a paper declaring me mentally incompetent. The good doctor hit record and kept receipts. She also hired a bargain bin private investigator to smear my military history that never existed because I never served. The lies were so sloppy, any vet could have torn them to shreds between sips of diner coffee. Then came the strike of pure lightning. Federally protected wetlands bulldozed without permits. Endangered salamanders paved under the promise of cul-de-sacs. An original environmental survey altered by Brad's consulting firm to turn marsh into non-significant grassland. Daily fines under the Endangered Species Act, $25,000 a day, a metronome of debts that would outlive a dynasty. The man who broke the silence bought his soul back. One photocopy at a time. Danny Kowalski, construction foreman, shoulders stooped from carrying orders he refused to obey. He brought photos, blueprints, emails, Brad pointing at wetlands and telling crews to bury them in concrete, Brad swapping pilings for pressure-treated lumber, Brad saying cheaper is faster and faster is money. Danny had quit rather than shovel that much shame. They'd harassed him for having a conscience, an endangered species of its own. Ruby's forensic accountant, Patty Goldman, spun the laptop toward us, fingers dancing across spreadsheets. Shell companies, offshore routes, construction loans taken with my land as collateral. 89 million in total fraud, numbers that hummed like high voltage. Inside Heritage Meadows, the mirror shattered. Title insurance refused to cover contested land, deeds untethered from reality, families paying mortgages on houses they might never truly own. A schoolteacher named Maria Santos cried slow tears at Ruby's desk and said, "They sold me forever. I brought my daughters home to a lie." It was time to squeeze. Vicky announced a Heritage Meadows family festival for the very day of the annexation vote. Balloons, barbecue, bounce houses, a camera-ready tableau of innocence. She'd force politicians to look into children's faces and rubber-stamp the theft. So we set our own table. Ruby coordinated EPA inspectors to arrive at 11, U.S. Marshals at 1, FBI on call, U.S. Attorney Marcus Webb, silver hair, wire rims, the kind of man who reads statutes like love letters, reviewing our evidentiary mountain and saying, "Your 1924 paperwork is tighter than bark on a tree." Dr. Sarah Lightfoot from EPA prepped sampling kits, and Reverend James Mitchell offered his church's sanctuary for displaced families. But the keystone, the twist that turned the river, waited in a courthouse basement that smelled like mothballs and old rain. Ruby called at 6 a.m. "Zeke, get here. Now." We hauled open file drawers long enough to count as crypts and found manila envelopes sealed before Eisenhower took office. The original railway easements my grandfather, Ezekiel Thornfield, Sr., negotiated in 1924 with Tennessee Central Railroad. Clause 7 gleamed like a hidden sword. Any unauthorized structure built on Thornfield property transfers automatically to the Thornfield family. Improvements, fixtures, the works. Federal filing. Federal jurisdiction. No county judge, no city council, No HOA queen could cut around it. We cross-checked the boundary. Stakes. Satellite imagery from 2019 showed the markers mysteriously shifted during the week I was in Oregon. Correcting for that put not just the 98 houses but the clubhouse, the pool, the tennis courts, and the 9-hole course squarely on Thornfield land. 8 million in amenities, 34 million in houses, 42 million in suburban arrogance, all of it mined by operation. A federal law, thanks to a century-old clause no one bothered to read or everyone hoped I'd never find. Brad, it turned out, had researched those very archives 3 years earlier through a railway historical society login. He'd gambled that if you bury a truth deep enough, an old farmer won't go digging where the dead sleep. He forgot I do my best work underground. The strategy wrote itself. We would not bulldoze families' lives. Marcus set up victim compensation pathways. I drafted fair rent-to-own agreements for anyone who wanted to stay once the land was lawfully mine. And Ruby's team built a media timeline that told the whole story clean. Wetlands, forgeries, money laundering, and the 1924 contract that turned theft into forfeiture. EPA would test and order evacuations if needed. U.S. Marshals would serve warrants safe from local interference. FBI would snip the financial web. Reverend Mitchell would cradle the fallout. We rehearsed like a small, stubborn army that believed in paper and sunlight. In my pocket, I carried my grandfather's compass, cool brass against my palm, the needle always true. I promised Martha at sunset that I'd walk out of the next day either with clean hands or not at all. She always loved the colors that show up right before dark, lavender and gold. Hope's last flare before night settles. Tomorrow, we'd bring our own dawn. Festival day broke postcard perfect. Blue sky, flags snapping, grills smoking, a stage dressed in bunting like a promise that never asked what it was promising. Vicky turned Heritage Meadows into a set from a wholesome commercial, children's choir trilling, local politicians swearing love for families into microphones, and cameras sweeping past federal agents disguised as the kind of men who never blend and yet somehow did. Overnight, someone cut my internet and slashed my tires again, left a note on my windshield that read like a threat drafted by a committee. Ruby's car got spray-painted, liars spelled wrong, which felt on brand. Brad hustled an emergency city council meeting for the morning, cash-stuffed envelopes caught on Ruby's hidden cameras like a B-movie with real consequences. My bank accounts froze, suspicious activity. The manager just happened to be Brad's brother-in-law. Starve the fight. It's an old tactic with a new tie. Inside the subdivision, bots bloomed on social media, choruses of identical phrasing praising community leadership. Vicky filed a $50 million defamation suit against Ruby and her paper. Tried to muzzle the press with volume instead of truth. Construction crews shoveled clean soil at dawn to hide contamination, and Danny filmed the cover-up with a pen camera that would later make jurors shake their heads in disbelief. They even called my children, Hannah in Portland and Luke in Atlanta, to suggest guardianship, to whisper that their father was cracking, that fighting for land was dishonoring Martha's memory. They didn't know that woman. They didn't know the line in her journal that I kept folded in my wallet. Right is not loud, it's steady. At 11 a.m., while the puppet show distracted toddlers, Dr. Sarah Lightfoot arrived with a picnic basket that held EPA test kits, not sandwiches. She drew water and soil, quietly, professionally, like a nurse changing a dressing, and found fresh concrete poured over wetlands in the night. Obstruction of justice, federal grade. Ruby texted me one word, nailed. Lunchtime brought Channel 7 and Brad with a grin wired to a microphone. He began the interview he'd scripted in his head for months. Fragile families, the menace of an unstable neighbor, the desperate plea to protect home and hearth when U.S. Marshals stepped into the frame and read him his rights. The camera didn't blink, neither did I. The click of handcuffs sounded like a gavel in a courthouse that finally remembered its job. Vicky tried to ride the storm like a show horse, but storms don't take riders. She screamed about conspiracies, about government persecution, about the deep state and elitists attacking working families. Her voice cracked. Phones recorded. The internet ate. Half the crowd stared. The other half began to see. Ruby's paper dropped the evidence package online, timelines, bank trails. Signature overlays, drone photos, wetland maps. The 1924 clause highlighted as if the past itself had brought a highlighter pen. Reverend Mitchell opened his church. Legal aid set up folding tables. Local businesses offered rooms and jobs and meals. The real kind of community, swallowing the counterfeit version the way the tide swallows chalk castles. Then Dr. Lightfoot took the gazebo mic with the voice like wind through corn. U.S. Marshals sealed Heritage Meadows as a federal crime scene, the phrase sounding both brutal and merciful. Families got 48 hours to gather their lives into boxes. The unraveling snapped threads everywhere at once. Sheriff Mike Ashworth arrived, tried to flex jurisdiction, then went pale when his own warrant got handed to him in front of the bandstand. 3 city council members followed. Money laundering, bribery, conspiracy, charged while funnel cake sugar still dusted their ties. The bank president found himself indicted for fraudulent mortgage instruments, and for a second you could hear nothing but flags popping in the wind. When the U.S. attorney, Marcus Webb, stepped up with a stack of arrest warrants, the crowd parted. He read 47 counts against Victoria Ashworth: wire fraud, money laundering, environmental crimes, conspiracy to commit theft, obstruction, each charge ringing out like a bell. Marshals clicked cuffs around manicured wrists. Vicky's last words from the back of the cruiser weren't the measured phrases of a PDA president. They were bile and slurs aimed at Hispanic families. The mask finally falling all the way off. I took the microphone last. No amplification, just the old field voice that can carry from one fence post to the next. I held the yellowed 1924 easement over my head and told them the truth my grandfather wrote into law before any of us were born. You build on Thornfield land without permission, everything you build becomes Thornfield property. It wasn't vengeance. It was a boundary line in ink that never fades. Maria Santos stepped up then, soft but steady, and said what needed saying. We wanted a home. We were lied to. In her words lived every family who'd signed papers they didn't know were forged, who'd painted nurseries over poisoned ground. I promised fair rent to own for anyone who wanted to stay when it was safe, a path to stability built on law, not lies. Marcus nodded. Reverend Mitchell said, Amen. National media rolled in like weather. Hashtags #heritage scam and #justice for Zeke climbing the trend. Ladders. But what mattered wasn't the viral arc. It was the way neighbors who'd been strangers stood in the same parking lot and decided to be a town again. 6 months went by like an old hymn, slow, solemn, beautiful if you let it be. EPA tape fluttered where manicured lawns used to pretend they were forever. Honeysuckle took back edges of the path. Cattle grazed where Martha once said the light pulled like honey at 6 p.m. Sentences came down with federal precision. Vicky Ashworth, 15 years. Brad Ashworth, 20 for racketeering. Sheriff Mike and 3 councilmen, 5 years each and a permanent scar on a county seal. I signed rent-to-own agreements with 23 families who chose to rebuild on properly zoned, environmentally sound ground, truth tattooed into every permit. Maria Santos became our community liaison, and her girls learned that salamanders come back when you stop poisoning their world. I took the windfall the law handed me, not as victory, but as responsibility, and started the Thornfield Foundation with $20 million, scholarships for first-generation students, workshops on property rights for folks who've never thought they'd need a lawyer until it was wildlife sanctuary, with boardwalks where school kids point and shout when an egret lifts like slow lightning. Universities brought a climate research station, and I watched scientists tramp through marsh with the same joy I feel measuring a clean boundary. Honest work, honest data. Ruby Morgan won a Pulitzer, then took a job at the Washington Post, still calling me once a month to ask if the creek's running clear. Her documentary about Heritage Meadows won an Emmy and became assigned viewing in journalism schools. How to handle a con when the con dresses like community service. Danny Kowalski testified before Congress. A whistleblower law now bears his name, and his restoration company employs crews who left dirty firms for clean work. The shockwaves kept traveling. FBI units uncovered similar schemes in dozens of towns, put a stop to billions in fraudulent developments. Congress wrote federal property verification into the bones of the system. The country learned what our county already knew. Greed wears khakis, fraud shakes your hand. And the law is only as strong as the people willing to find the right page and read it out loud. Me. I teach surveying at the community college now. I hold up a tape measure in class and say, "This thing doesn't lie." People do. So you document everything. I tell them boots must get muddy. That a boundary isn't a suggestion, it's a promise. At our annual Heritage Festival, no bounce houses, just bluegrass and church pies and a wall of photos showing wetlands restored, families rehoused, contracts signed with ink that won't run. At dusk, I visit Martha, tell her what grew back, who graduated, which calves got the curious eyes. It still hurts, the kind that doesn't ask permission, but grief, I've learned, is a kind of boundary too, a line between what we lost and the duty we still owe. Some nights, I open her journal to that line that saved me more than once. Zeke fights for what's right, not what's easy. Then I close the book and listen to crickets and feel the land settle for the night, like a house exhaling after guests have gone. Here's the last thing I'll say, and I'll say it the way my grandfather would have, standing at a fence with a thermos and a sunrise. Property rights are not about money. They are about memory and responsibility. About who tends the creek and who cleans the ditch. About whether a child grows up believing your children's future. We got ours back, not with rage, but with maps, deeds, and the kind of neighbors who will stand in a parking lot and decide not to be afraid anymore. Justice did not arrive like thunder. It arrived like footsteps in the right direction, signatures in the right boxes, voices in the right rooms. And when the moment came to speak, we spoke. We didn't shout. We proved. And the law, for once, remembered it belonged to all of us. Now it's your turn at the line. Where is the boundary between order and oppression? When does protecting property values become a costume for theft? Does justice work best like water, soft and persistent, or like stone, firm and final? And when a community stands face to face with people who bend the rules to fit their greed,